Skeletons of the Marital Closet by Tang. Chapter 1571. Shawn, despite having a head full of silver hair, still did not look his age. He was handsome, with chiseled features, and looked like someone who had dyed his hair silver. One could say he bore a striking resemblance to a Hollywood film star. In my 30s. Unfortunately, there were 4 years of my life without you, Shawn replied in a low voice. Enough with the cheesy lines. I just wanted to say you're in your 30s and jealous of Joshua here. Isn't that childish? It's getting unbearable and you're making it difficult for poor Nicole. Gale chuckled. How could she choose between her daddy and her brother? Gale could not bear it. Am I making things difficult for her? Shawn glanced toward the hospital bed. They seemed to be having a good time chatting. You've had your hugs and kisses. Aren't you satisfied? You've flaunted enough. It's time to share Nicole with others, right? Shawn leaned in and whispered, Okay, Nicole belongs to Joshua. You belong to me. It frightened Gale, who quickly stepped back. The kids are around. What are you doing? Nothing special. Gale handed him a laptop, saying, Get back to work. Shawn leaned back on the sofa, looking at the 3 most important people in his life. He had never dared to imagine he would have it all. Joshua and Nicole were chatting happily. Gale could occasionally glance at them lovingly. The 3 of them were his whole world. He had to protect them. It looked like it was about to rain. It was not a Memorial Day, so the suburban graveyard was empty. A luxury car parked at the foot of the hill. The driver got out and respectfully opened the car door. Mr. Wood, Mrs. Wood, we've arrived. Shawn wore well-tailored trousers and shining, spotless leather shoes stepped out. After stepping out, he reached back into the car, extending his hand. Gaily. A delicate hand was placed in his palm. Then, Gale alighted from the car. The 2 stood side by side, a sight to behold. Their elegant presence shifted the mood in the somber graveyard. Shawn wore a black suit, and Gale wore a long black dress. They looked dignified and elegant. Aram stood at a distance and watched silently. He watched the couple's synchronized movements, glances, and affectionate expressions. Aram did not greet them because he felt he was unnecessary. How could he come between Shawn and Gale? How could he have ever thought that he could take Gale away from Shawn by working a little harder? He was too naive. Shawn meant too much to Gale. Gale jumped into the ocean yet chose to bear 2 children for him. Her fate was linked to him. She had always loved him. How could Aram compete with Shawn? Chapter 1572. Aram knew that he would never be better than Shawn. However, he was the one who first proposed to Gale, even before Sam. Gale saw him and greeted, Aram, what a coincidence. I was waiting for you, Aram replied. Waiting for me? The path to her grave is a little far. I was worried you and Mr. Wood might get lost, so I came to lead the way. The graveyard was large. It was indeed easy to get lost. However, with Shawn around, Gale felt no fear whatsoever. She felt extremely secure with him there, no matter how dangerous it might be. Aram turned around and started walking. The burial spot was bought at the very last minute, and no good lots were left. Sorry to trouble Mr. Wood and Mrs. Wood. Gale glanced sideways at Shawn. Aram seemed off. He was polite, distant, and calm. Shawn remained silent, squeezing Gale's hand tightly and leading her up the hill. Natalie's funeral was extremely simple. Only her parents and Aram came to send her off on this final journey. Shawn and Gale hated her to the bone. They were not there to mourn her. She was not deserving. Due to rain last night, the ground was a bit slippery. Gale almost slipped several times, but fortunately Shawn was there to hold her. Be careful. I'm fine. Arm kept walking ahead without turning back. Matthew cleaned dust and dirt off the tombstone on Natalie's grave. Heather sat beside him, leaning against the tombstone, repeatedly caressing the small memorial photo on it. Natalie, my precious daughter, why did you leave me? How am I supposed to live from now on? I have money now. Natalie, if you come back to life, I'll give you all this money, okay? What's the point of having money without you? I would live in comfort, but my heart is forever broken. Heather pressed against the memorial photo. If you come back to life, if you wake up, I won't dare to want anything anymore. Matthew pulled her away. Heather. What? Don't touch me. I want to talk to Natalie. Heather waved away his hand. I'm going to stay here with my daughter. I won't go anywhere. I had never gotten a day with my own daughter. Matthew sighed helplessly, letting Heather hold onto the tombstone. Uncle. Aram walked over. Matthew's heart skipped a beat. He looked up and saw Gale and Shawn behind Aram. They've come. Right. Shawn and Gale stood aside, maintaining a certain distance from the grave. Both of their expressions were extremely cold. Chapter 1573. They would not mourn her death. Matthew looked at Gale's empty hands. No flowers? Gale, she's dead. And you didn't even bring a bouquet of flowers? Gale replied, Maybe you misunderstood. I'm not here to mourn her. Then, I'm here for Heather. She seems, well, not quite normal, Gale said. Heather, completely disregarding who was around or what was happening, continued to hold onto the tombstone, caressing Natalie's memorial photo. She muttered to herself. Matthew explained. Since Natalie's death, she's been murmuring about Natalie to herself. She was a bad mother. What is there to regret? Gale, she's gone. Can't we just let bygones be bygones? Gale clarified. No, we can't. Some things would not just disappear with death. Natalie's sins lingered forever. The harm caused would be everlasting. Must she forgive and let go just because she had died? Matthew wanted to say something, but Gale spoke first. There is nothing to say. Natalie is only my blood sister. I don't recognize her as my sister, and Mom won't either. The only one who would consider her your daughter is you. Natalie is your child by blood. Naturally, you love her. To me, Natalie is evidence of your extramarital affair and betrayal of Mom. You've been trying to bring Natalie into the Yarn family. In your heart, she's more important than me, right? Matthew opened his mouth, then closed it again. After a long silence, he said, Gale, both you and Natalie are my daughters. I swear I don't favor her more than you, even though I like Heather and married Mary only because she could help me. Both children are my flesh and blood. I was angry and said I shouldn't have let Mary give birth to you. I said that in the heat of the moment. I was angry because you never forgave Natalie. That's why I said that. I will apologize to you. I'm sorry. Don't take it too hard. Gale looked at him indifferently. The milk is spilled. Apologizing won't solve anything. Gale had nightmares for several nights because of what he said. Her biological father told her that she should have been aborted and that she should not have been born. That was unbearable. I don't expect you to forgive me. Mary and you despise me. Now, with Natalie dead and Heather's going a bit crazy, my life is over. Matthew's face was ashen. Gale said, This is the consequence you brought upon yourself. Now you're just reaping what you sowed. At the moment of Matthew's affair, at the moment Heather got pregnant, at the moment Natalie was born, Matthew should have thought about the consequences once the truth was out. People have to pay the price for their actions. Gale, you blame me, right? You blame me for caring more about Natalie and for treating her better. She paused for a few seconds, then nodded. Yes. Gale was puzzled. If Matthew kept saying that he treated both daughters equally, why had his actions shown a clear bias toward Natalie? It bothered Gale. Matthew dusted off his hands, looking much older and more haggard. Chapter 1574. I treated Natalie well because she had so little to begin with. Gale, you had things she could never get, no matter how hard she tried. So I always thought about giving her a bit more because you already have plenty, Matthew said. You are Mary's daughter, and Natalie's is Heather's. Your mother determined the difference between you and Natalie. You are a true young lady of a wealthy family, whereas she, although my daughter, doesn't have the same birthright as you. Later, when you went missing, she had the chance to be adopted into the Yarn family and marry. She could enjoy the status and treatment that you could have had. Then, when we found you, we realized you would be Mrs. Wood's esteemed wife. Yet, Natalie first lost her status in the Yarn family, then in the Lefting family. She lost everything. She only has me as her father. Matthew sighed repeatedly. She suddenly lost it all. I expected her not to handle the blow well, so I thought of giving her as much support as possible so she could not dwell in despair. You never needed all those things I gave to Natalie, Gale. For you, my fatherly love is optional, inconsequential, but for Natalie, I am her only hope. Matthew looked at Gale. Do you understand? Suddenly, Gale laughed. So that's how it is. Yes, you have everything and don't need what I give you. But Natalie has so little and she needs me. What did your favoritism achieve? Did Natalie appreciate you? Did you save her from death? No, you failed. She died. I tried my best, but I was useless and powerless. Gale spoke sternly. Matthew, being born with a lot doesn't mean I would be fine with giving some of it up. Moreover, Natalie always had enough. It was her own insatiable greed that caused her downfall. I know, but Gale, you have many people around you. You don't need your biological father, Matthew explained. I don't need you. The Natalie you desperately protected is dead. Now you'll need to come here every year to visit her grave. Your beloved Heather is half mad and needs your constant care. You will spend your life guarding them, Gale replied. Chapter 1575. Enough. I don't want to hear it anymore, Gale interrupted him. Matthew's reasons were so absurd. Why should the fatherly love meant for her be given to Natalie just because she was born out of an affair? Besides, Natalie was not that pitiful. At least she had food and shelter, health, and even good looks. She already had a much better life than most people. Matthew stood alone, cautiously glancing at Gale, then retracted his gaze. He looked somewhat pitiful. He once was a prominent figure in Sis City, a respected chairman of a listed company and the head of the Yarn family. Now, he had nothing and had to bend to Gale. Fine, fine. I won't bother you anymore, Gale. I apologize to you and your mother. Now, things have come to this, and I just want... Matthew sighed deeply. He paused. Gale asked, What do you want? Do you think you have the right to choose? I want to leave Sis City with Heather, and you will never see us again. You can consider us dead. You still haven't given up on her. Matthew shook his head. She has been with me for the most of my life. How can I just abandon her? Gale sarcastically smiled. You are certainly a lovely couple. Perhaps we are really in love. Back then, even so with many women around me, I liked her and chose her. Now, if I ignore her, she'll be miserable, Matthew replied. What fate awaited a middle-aged, unmarried woman with mental issues and no children? Either homelessness, destitution, rummaging through trash for food on the streets, or even prostitution. Matthew could not bear it. He was unreliable, but not when it came to Heather. Gale looked at him and asked, I can let you leave with Heather. Really? Matthew was somewhat surprised. Gale, you're not lying to me, are you? No. Moreover, I can give you some money. Do you have any conditions? Matthew felt like he had just hit the jackpot, a bit in disbelief at his stroke of good luck. Gale, who detested him, hated his affair, and hated how well he treated Natalie. Why would she let him go with some money? Gale said, I have something to ask Heather. Chapter 1576. Matthew took 2 steps back and turned to look at Heather, who was still holding onto the tombstone. She alternated between crying and laughing, her hair disheveled, and her black clothes were smeared with dirt. Just as Gale was about to walk toward her, Shawn held her back. He said, Don't go over. Heather might genuinely be insane or pretending, and she might hurt you. It's okay. You are here with me, Gale said. Gale. Her trust in him deeply moved him, but he was still worried. Shawn could not guarantee that he could protect her if danger struck, although he would try his best. Gale held his hand, giving it a light pat. Heather could not cause much trouble with him, Aram and Matthew present. I'm just going over to ask her a few questions. If you're worried, stand behind me, Gale said, looking into his eyes. Shawn still did not let go. Gale smiled at him, withdrew her hand, and walked briskly toward Heather. Heather completely ignored her, still focused on Natalie. Gale stood beside her. Natalie's dead. Accept the reality. Only then did Heather raise her head and looked at her. She fell from over 30 floors and died on the spot. Don't you remember? Gale said. Heather remained silent for a long time before nodding. I remember. Pretending to be crazy serves no purpose. You might get an ounce of respect from me without it. Heather did not respond. Gale continued. I'm here to talk to you like before. You know what it's about. Heather slowly stood up and locked eyes with Gale. You mean the incident when you were a child, right? Yes. Are the conditions you set earlier still valid? As long as I confess, you'll let me go? Give me money and won't pursue it further? Heather asked. Yes. Heather stared into her eyes for several seconds. Really? Why would I lie to you when you are in this state? Natalie is dead, and you're the one who's most distressed about it. Whatever I do to you now won't make much sense. Letting you live this meaningless life is better than any punishment, Gale said. Heather laughed. Yes, living like this was more painful than death. She would live without her daughter, without hope. She used to think that when her daughter grew up and acknowledged her as her birth mother, and Matthew's position in the company stabilized, she could turn her life around. Someday, she could elevate her status above Mary and become the rightful Honorable Mrs. Yarn. That hope kept Heather going for 20 years. All her hope had shattered. Natalie was dead, Matthew had nothing, and Heather came out of it with nothing. The days ahead were bitter. You're right, Gale. I'm miserable. It's just a waste of time for you to attack me. It's better to get the truth from me and set me free so I can live out of my pathetic life, Heather murmured. Chapter 1577. Gale looked at her with a soft yet determined gaze. So, tell me, what really happened? Gale, why you have always believed that Heather had anything to do with it? Matthew asked. You wandered off and got lost. The police investigated, and there was no evidence pointing to her abducting you. Aram stood on the side, feeling shocked. Was Gale's childhood disappearance somehow connected to Heather? It sounded unbelievable at first, but after giving it some thought, Aram felt that Heather did have a motive. She was the biggest beneficiary. Heather must have taken Gale away, sent her to an orphanage, and sent Natalie to the Yarn family to be raised as a dignified young lady. That way, her daughter could enjoy everything that belonged to Gale, including the engagement. Was that the truth? The realization struck Aram suddenly. He could not wait to hear Heather's answer. Over these years, I've tried to find the truth, but I never found anything. Aram spoke up. Shawn glanced at him and said, "That's because you never knew about Heather." Yes, I never expected that Natalie is actually her biological daughter. It was too absurd. Aram had always thought that Natalie was adopted by the Yarn family, a consolation for Matthew and Mary, who had lost their own daughter. These revelations were already shocking enough, but learning that Heather might be the one behind Gale's kidnapping left Aram at a loss for words. He stared at Heather and asked, "Are you truly the mastermind behind this?" Heather nodded slowly. "Yes." Heather's voice, though very soft, landed like a heavy bomb in everyone's heart. She admitted it. Heather had indeed kidnapped the young Gale. "Heather!" Matthew almost could not catch his breath. His eyes widened, trembling as he pointed at her. "How? How could you? How?" He stuttered, utterly shocked by his news. "It was me. I was the one who took Gale away all those years ago," Heather continued. She was calm, collected, and cold. "I never doubted you for a moment. I could never have imagined that you would do something like this. I trusted you so much. Gale mentioned a few times that you might be the culprit, and I denied it. I stood by your side, defended you, but—" Heather was indeed the culprit. Matthew was too surprised and heartbroken. He had always believed that, despite Heather's love for money and vanity, she was not malicious. She would never commit such acts. He had been too naive. He was fooled by Heather's appearance and her years of apparent thoughtfulness. "I never asked you to believe me, Matthew. You've never once questioned whether Gale's disappearance had anything to do with me," Heather said. "Because I believed you wouldn't do such a thing." "But I did. How could my Natalie enter the Yarn family if she didn't leave? How could she live the life of a wealthy young lady, get engaged, and have such a good fortune?" Chapter 1578. Matthew's face turned crimson, then purple. For a moment, he could not accept this truth. Matthew felt the pain of being betrayed by the person he trusted and loved the most. Heather's hand rested on the tombstone. "I admit it. I've guarded this secret for so many years and never told anyone. I might as well speak my mind since things have come to this." "Heather, this was your plan from the start!" Matthew exclaimed. "Yes." Matthew took a few short breaths in succession. "When you suggested that I should adopt Natalie, I thought it was an opportunistic idea. But it turns out it was a deliberately planned scheme." "Exactly. Everything was meticulously planned. Matthew, they're both your daughters. Why should only Mary's daughter enjoy wealth and prosperity?" Heather said, looking at him. "I did it because you, Matthew, are incapable." Heather pointed at him, her fingernail almost poking into his eyes. "You lacked ability and strategy. You were scared to answer my calls whenever you were with the Yarn family. You even took longer to respond to my messages, afraid Mary might find out. I can endure, I can wait, but Natalie can't. She needs to be raised in a good home. She needs to go to school." "So you came up with such a malicious plan?" Matthew asked. Heather tilted her head back and laughed heartily. "Malicious? Yes, malicious. It took you so many years to finally see my true colors." She turned to face Gale and said, "Do you know you were adorable when you were little? You had big, bright eyes and soft skin like a princess. You were exactly like a princess. Your appearance back then is a spitting image of your daughter, Nicole. Mary adored you, took you everywhere because you were her only daughter. She couldn't bear children anymore after you. She was too weak. When she gave birth to you, she almost lost her life. When she took you out, I hid in the corner, secretly observing you and your mother for a whole month. I followed you both everywhere like a stalker. I watched you and your mother enter various high-end establishments, meet all kinds of influential figures, and spend money lavishly. She bought the bag I had to beg Matthew for without a second thought. It was then that I thought, I might not become Mary, but can my daughter become you? Can she live the life I can't? The wind blew through the cemetery cool and eerily. Heather's sharp voice echoed in Gale's ears. Finally, Gale heard the answer she wanted to hear. She asked, Heather, you took me away at that charity banquet? Chapter 1579. That's right. I thought of many ways and made many plans. Finally, I decided the charity banquet had the best chance to snatch you away. How did you do it? Heather chuckled twice. Do you really need to know the details? Yes, Heather shrugged and said. It's quite simple. I sneaked into that charity banquet. I noticed you like desserts, cakes and such, but Mary always stopped you, afraid you'd get cavities. So I prepared a beautiful carton cake to attract you. Sure enough, you were quickly drawn to it. The moment you saw that cake, you walked straight toward me. Once you got close, I immediately covered your mouth. Heather raised her hand, revealing two shallow scars on her hand. Look, Gale, you bit me at that time and left a scar. You were sharp-toothed even as a child, and looking at you now, you're still the same. Nothing has changed. Gale glanced at the scar. That was the least of her concerns. She wanted to know more about how Heather took her away from the charity banquet. Go on. I bit you. How did you still manage to take me away successfully? Gale said. Heather answered disdainfully. You were just a little kid. I just strangled you. Your face turned red from lack of air and you fainted. At this moment, Heather looked regretful. I thought I had killed you. I got scared and quickly loosened my grip. Actually, looking back now, I wasn't ruthless enough and was still too soft-hearted. I should have exerted more force and killed you. She gritted her teeth. If you died, you wouldn't be here again 20 years later to ruin my daughter's life. Gale, it's my fault for not being ruthless enough back then. I was too young. If you had died then, none of this would have happened today. Natalie wouldn't die. The more Heather spoke, the more agitated she became. She looked fierce and menacing, advancing step by step toward Gale. However, she did not have the chance to get close to Gale. Matthew blocked her way. At the same time, Shawn reached out, pulling her into his embrace. He gazed at Heather fiercely. Heather, what are you trying to do? You are still so bitter. Why? I regret it. Why didn't I just kill her? Why did I leave her alive? Chapter 1580. Heather glared at Gale. After you fainted, I took you to the loading bay, placed you in a cardboard box, and loaded you onto a large truck to quietly transport you out of the hotel. As soon as the truck drove away, I saw security personnel gathering at the entrance, beginning to seal off all the hotel exits. You had already been taken away. Mary lost her precious daughter. Heather leaned against Matthew's chest, laughing maniacally. Matthew, I felt so excited then. However, you started neglecting me, and you spent more time with Mary because of Gale's disappearance. I felt so sad. You still cared about the daughter you had with her. I took the opportunity and suggested you adopt Natalie. Although you hesitated, you couldn't deny my request. You couldn't bear to see Natalie suffer with me. That's how it happened. That's it. Matthew, you finally know the truth now. You had seen my malicious side. You won't want me anymore. You hate me, right? You want to get rid of me, Heather shouted. I kidnapped your daughter and manipulated you. I have no feelings for you. Matthew looked at her with sorrow and opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Heather pressed. Speak. Just say it. You want to scold me. You can even hit me, slap me a few times. She grabbed Matthew's hand and slapped herself. However, Matthew forcefully pulled his hand back. Heather, I don't hit women. Hit me. I've made such a big mistake. I not only deserve a slap, I deserve to die. Heather grabbed his wrist tightly. Now you can tell Gale that you knew nothing about her disappearance, that you were really sad, that you are still a conscientious father. Heather pushed Matthew toward Gale. She genuinely wanted to push Matthew away from herself. She wanted to bear all the blame. After all, he was Gale's father. As long as he stayed in this city, he would still have a place in the world. Why continue a better life with a woman like her? So, although Heather seemed to be going mad, she was plotting a way out for Matthew. Heather, Heather, Matthew sighed deeply. He saw through her intentions. Don't push me away. Living alone is also meaningless. Both of us have struggled through so many years together. Let's just continue with that, Matthew said. Heather suddenly fell silent, staring at Matthew fixedly. Matthew also looked at her, not letting go of his hand. Then, Heather began to tremble uncontrollably. Matthew still chose to stay with her. Maybe he truly loved her. Heather asked, Why bother? You don't have to settle for me. Matthew, you have options. Let it go, Heather. I said it before. We are the most suitable for each other. We're both selfish and hypocritical. Gale watched with a cold and stony gaze.